And welcome to everyone joining in on the live stream. So I have the honor of introducing our speaker today. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Samantha Boland. I work in the Office of Alumni Relations on the Fin Engagement Signature Programs team and help oversee the NU program. So enough about me. So today we have Dr. Brian Helmuth, who is a professor at the Marine Science Center at Northeastern University, with a joint appointment in the Department of Marine and Environmental Sciences and the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. Some of you may remember him because he actually did an NU event for us about a year or 2 years ago?
2015, yeah.
2015, so a few years ago, with the Mission 31 project. So we're very excited to have him back. His research and teaching focus on predicting the likely ecological impacts of climate change on coastal ecosystems and on the development of projects that are scientifically accurate, understandable, and useful by a diverse array of stakeholders. He has authored or co-authored over 80 peer-reviewed journal articles in the areas of climate change and marine ecology. His lab group also collaborates with formal and informal educators, such as the Museum of Science, to develop cutting-edge technologies to facilitate science learning for K-16 students, as well as the general public. He has also published several popular magazine articles, and his research was recently highlighted in the New York Times. A veteran of several saturation missions in the Aquarius underwater habitat, Professor Helmuth was a science advisor on Fabian Cousteau's Mission 31 project in 2014. He is a fellow of the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program, which trains select scientists to interact with policymakers, journalists, and the public, and in 2011 was named a Google Science Communication Fellow in the area of climate change. Professor Helmuth has conducted research on every continent, with recent work focusing on the effects of climate change in the Middle East and in China, as well as closer to home in the Gulf of Maine. Today, he will discuss how cutting-edge technology can be used to explore how coastal animals experience their environments and how our perceptions of the world unconsciously frame the ways in which we talk about climate change and its impacts. So welcome, Professor Helmuth.
Thanks, Samantha. Thanks. It's great to be here among my fellow alumni. I did my master's degree here in 1991 out of the Marine Science Center. And as I'm sure you guys have noticed, Northeastern has changed a lot and is continuing to change over the decades. And it's amazing to see this. So I've been at Northeastern about 5 years now and have just loved every minute of it, of working here. I have noticed that some things never change though. One of the classes I teach is a freshman class, and no one ever sits in the front row. So I'm beginning to wonder if it's something I should look into here, whether I'm like sending out a vibe or. But what I want to talk to you today about is the direction my lab has headed in recent years, and is why I have a joint appointment in both the Department of Marine Environmental Sciences and the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. Because we study climate change, but as anyone who studies climate change, especially in the US knows, a big piece of that is how do you communicate it? How do you take that and make it useful? Northeastern is famous for use-inspired research. Taking what we know about climate change and moving it to the real world is a real challenge. I mean, we know that this has become, at least is perceived as a political hot potato. What I want to go through today, though, is kind of this back and forth between the science of what we know, how we communicate that, and how that not only affects our ability to communicate to non-scientists, but even affects how we as scientists look at our changing world. So as a climate scientist, I didn't start off that way. I didn't, grow up and say, I'm going to study climate change impacts. And even in graduate school, I didn't say, I want to study climate change. Like most climate change scientists, I had to do it because everything I was studying started dying. So, I would go out and look at reefs that look like this. You'd come back a year later after an anomalously warm event, it would look like this. You give it a little bit more time, and it ends up being a parking lot. More often than not, this will end up becoming covered with oozing algae, and the corals are just not going to come back. And I'll tell you right now, it's very easy to get depressed doing the kind of stuff that I do. So what you rapidly realize is that if you want to really study anything about nature today, I mean, there are still a couple pristine sites left around the world, and we still look at those as models, but really most of the scientific community today, and Northeastern in particular, again, which is why I came here, is focus on this idea of what we call coupled human-natural ecosystems. This idea that humans are not separate from the ecosystems we live in, nor are ecosystems kind of magically functioning as the natural world separate from humans. Rather, we have to look at this back and forth between what we humans do to the environment, then also what the environment does back to us. And we've had a couple of instances recently where we've got hit between the eyes with the 3 hurricanes. So a big piece of that then is understanding perceptions. It's understanding how we look at nature, how we look at changes around us, how we interpret that, how we put this into kind of a framework or context of how we view the world. And without that step, we really can't move from the science to the application. So what I want to focus on for the first part of the lecture and give you kind of a couple of examples of this is how do our very human perceptions, our very human biases, we have a very different way of experiencing our world than most organisms do. How does that affect our ability to detect change, to recognize it as such, and to communicate it? So a big piece of this then is pattern recognition. So we can look at this and we see all these are some representation of the Mona Lisa, right? Even if some of these are pretty wild with the minions, or this is my daughters watch My Little Ponies. This is one of my favorite ones. There's something about these that tells us that they're all representations of the Mona Lisa, even though the colors are different, the faces are different. I mean, in one case it's a pony. We can tell pretty quickly that these are all different representations of the Mona Lisa, and it's not an active thought process. I mean, if I just showed you one of these, you immediately would know what I was talking about. This comes down to what Richard Kahneman has called System 1 and System 2 processes, or slow and fast thinking. Fast thinking, which he argues is about 95% of our reactions, are those shorthand ways that we look at the world. How we can look at something and immediately come to kind of a first glance judgment of what we're looking at. And it's only once we kind of slow down and start adding in more facts that we get to this kind of system 2 thinking, this slower thinking. And a lot of what he argues is that the impact of this system 1 on our system 2 thinking is enormous. We have these biases that we never recognize we have. It really impacts our world. So even when we're shown data or patterns that are contrary to our expectations, it's really hard for us to kind of at a gut level accept that those are happening. And this is a good thing, right? I mean, over evolutionary time, it's no mistake that we have evolved this kind of system 1 approach. Because if you were living tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, scientists would not have done very well. We're sitting there kind of analyzing the call of the lion to see whether it's the western subspecies or the eastern subspecies. A mountain lion, you're toast. So being able to recognize that, man, this is danger really quickly is really evolutionarily to our advantage. And so having shorthands is good in that sense. But what I want to get into today is how that extends into how we view the world around us, and in particular in nature, how we conceptualize it. So as an ecologist, if you can remember back to the last biology class you've had, or any science class, the first thing you do is you look for pattern. You go out into nature, you look and say, all right, I think I see a pattern. I want to try to explain it. So we may look at a mountainside like this, and what we can see is that there's a tree line. So above here, there really aren't any trees. We can see one species of tree that's replaced by another one. We can then conceptualize this as something like this, where it's an idealized version of what we see out in the field. So if you open up any textbook, you're going to see, this is vegetation zonation in mountains. We know that it's a lot neater than we see in the field. We know that it's ignoring a lot of that messiness where you see these little dips and divots. And so we can then draw these things as straight lines. So it's a really good heuristic tool for thinking about the pattern we see in nature that we then go out and we want to test. And indeed, this is really crucial to the scientific process. We kind of combine this inductive and deductive reasoning where we see pattern, we try to explain it, we come up with experiments to try to define what we see in the field. But a lot of it is based on the pattern that we see. Where this gets into trouble, and if you look at that one just for a minute, how many people see a panda? Okay, look at it a minute longer, see if it goes away. So this is just a still image. I mean, this is just an optical illusion. It's not a GIF where the panda's coming in and out. This is all happening in your brain. And I'm sure most of you have seen this before, right? I mean, where either this is a woman where this is her nose, this is her mouth, or this is a woman where this is her nose, that's her ear, that's a necklace. Same thing, right? So, yeah, exactly. It's some of these things you kind of squint, you look like this a little bit.
Now I get it.
But it's the same information, but we're perceiving it very different ways. I mean, I could probably prime you and start talking about a young woman, and you might be more likely to see the chin and the nose if I primed you with that. But this really gets to what we're facing today. And I do want to say I'm not talking about alternative facts here. I mean, alternative facts are where there is objective reality and we ignore objective reality. What I'm talking about is just like in the previous picture, where it's the same facts, it's the same data. We're admitting it that it's the same facts. We can make the same measurements, but we're interpreting its importance, or we're interpreting what it means in very different ways. So I just want to point out this is all still factually based, but it still rests on how we perceive that environment around us. So I want to give you one idea that we talk about a lot called shifting baselines. Has anybody heard of shifting baselines before? All right. So if you went out, who here fishes? All right. Would you say that's a pretty good catch? Looks pretty good, right? Okay. So what if I then put it in context of that exact same fishing charter from back in 1958?
Wow, that's so good.
Now does it look so good? Yeah. Okay, so now that I've primed you, now that I've given you the context of what it used to be, now all of a sudden that doesn't look so great. And we can do this over a progression of time. So we can look, this is a series of pictures that are all taken from the same fishing charter, same time of year, over time. And it's an enormous, enormous difference, right? So this is what the idea of shifting baselines tells us. It's this idea that our perceptions of what's normal rely really heavily on the very recent past. So for what we've seen in the past 3 years, that's normal. It's only when we use data, when we do things like photographs, or we talk to someone who remembers the environment very differently than we see today, that we really realize that this is changing over time. I mean, the analogy is often used as a frog in a cooking pot, that if you slowly raise the temperature on the frog will boil and die because it's not noticing these subtle changes because, well, compared to what it was 5 minutes ago, it's really not that different. But over the period of time, we do see these large changes. So this is one of the things that we kind of battle. I mean, again, with looking at the strength of hurricanes or the frequency of high-intensity hurricanes, yes, there have always been hurricanes. Yes, there have always been Category 5 hurricanes. But we know now that since the 1980s, the incidence of these Category 4 and 5 hurricanes is increased significantly. But that's hard to detect just based on prior experience. So what do we do as scientists to get around this? We try to go to data, right? And so we like to take things, we like to make measurements, we like to make graphs. So these are the facts. I mean, we can go out, we can make a measurement of whatever y is as a function of x. Is there a pattern here? Yeah? Okay. How about now? Does that help? So now if I kind of guide your eyes, now all of a sudden we're kind of seeing that, well, okay, maybe there's a positive relationship here where x is low, y is low, where x is high, y is high. Again, same data, I've just kind of guided your eyes. And we can, of course, use statistics for this. And so this is really what we do as scientists is, you know, we run statistics religiously, and that tells us whether there really is a significant relationship between the variables we're looking at. It's not that we think it is or not. We run these statistics. So what this means with an R squared of 0.97 is that 97% of the relationship is explained between whatever x is and whatever y is. So, you know, that's a pretty good fit, right? Until I show you what the axes are. There's this awesome website where you can pull up these data sets and just start correlating with one another. And so this is the total U.S. highway fatality risk as a function of fresh lemons imported to USA from Mexico. I would challenge any of you to come up with a really rational explanation for why these two things are really tightly linked. So, you know, what's really going on? It probably is whatever is impacting highway fatality risk. I mean, maybe it's incidence of floods. Maybe it is hailstorms. That was also having a similar effect on fresh lemons. But we get the perception of a relationship between these two because they're what we call covariant with one another. And so in this case, even statistics are going to lead us astray. You have to understand something about the causality here. So this really drives home that really to trust relationships, to trust patterns we see in nature, we have to have a causal relationship. We have to understand what's driving the other. So again, you've probably seen this. This is global average temperature on this axis and the number of pirates in the inverse axis down here.
Yeah.
So as the number of pirates decreases, the temperature increases. So again, if there's a causal relationship, we should fight climate change by increasing piracy. Not so much. It's just that over time, the number of pirates has decreased, and over time, the global temperatures have increased. So why is it that we can laugh and we know that this is bogus, but when we look at a relationship like this, where this is showing temperature and carbon dioxide over the last 400,000 years, now all of a sudden we have confidence that there's really a relationship between these two. And that's where the science matters. That's where getting to an understanding really makes a difference. So for example, the red is temperature, the blue is carbon dioxide. You can see that generally as one decreases, the other one decreases. In some cases, for example, we see the temperature change before we see the CO2 change, but we know that's because there are other drivers of climate change in the past, things like the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit. So we understand the mechanisms that drive that, and so it really makes sense, and we can test these things independently. We don't have to kind of just make stories. We can go back and we can test these things. And so this really gets down to the center of the perceived debate that we see in the public eye. And again, I can tell you, this has not been a debate in the scientific community for 30 years. I mean, you look at survey after survey of scientists, now up to 99% of scientists in the field understand that the climate change is real. But we're seeing the same world, we're seeing the same data, but we're coming to very, very different conclusions about what's driving those changes. And in some cases, we're even arguing about whether those changes are even happening. So how do we use our understanding of science not only to get at the root causes of this so that we can find solutions, but then more importantly in some ways, how do we then use our understanding of people's perceptions to communicate that? So I want to show you a case study in the journal Science. I mean, Science and Nature are the two premier journals in all of scientific inquiry. You've seen grown people cry when they get turned down by Science and Nature because it's so hard to get a paper in here. They have about a 95% rejection rate. If you have a couple of science papers in your career, you're doing really well. So this is a paper that came out in 2011 where they followed the elevation on the side of a mountain of different plant species. So if you remember back to that graph I showed you with the different plant species moving up and down a slope, the expectation is as conditions get warmer at the base of the mountain, you should expect to see on average the vegetation starting to shift upwards, right, where it's colder. So just like you see these geographic shifts, what the expectation is that you should see these elevation shifts. What they found is that if you look at the historic elevation as a function of time, it went exactly the opposite direction. On average, all of the zones started shifting down, despite the fact that there was an overall increase in temperature. So it's getting warmer, but all the plant species are moving down. And as you can imagine, the internet went crazy. Another IPCC claim contradicted with new science. Rush Limbaugh got into airwaves and started talking about how this is showing that it's a bunch of BS. Okay, so what happened? Was this really evidence that climate change wasn't happening? No. What happened was that, yes, temperatures were increasing, but so was water availability. In other words, this is a paper in Science, the premier journal in the world, and the central point that they're made is that plants require both optimal temperatures and a lot of water. That's it. I mean, if anybody's grown plants, you know this, right? I mean, if you don't water a plant, it really doesn't matter how hot it gets. Or if you change the temperature, you can counteract that with water. But again, this made it into Science, and I'm not criticizing this paper. I've had a similar paper in Science that kind of came to a similar conclusion. But the reason why this was front and center news was it went against this generalized expectation, this generalization of what we expect to see with climate change, because it showed the opposite to that trend. My work has been picked out a lot because of this, because we look at a lot of this variability. You've all heard of the IPCC. There's something called the NIPCC that is paid for by the Heartland Institute. Every time an IPCC report comes out, they come out with one that purports to show that climate change isn't happening. And I went to a meeting one time and somebody came up and told me that my lab's work is featured on about 5 pages of this, where they're going through, they're cherry picking what we found. And again, using these exceptions to the generalization, saying that this is evidence that that climate change isn't happening. So who's to blame for this? I think in large part, there's a lot of blame to go around, but I think a lot of that actually comes back to scientists and the way that we have been talking about climate change. I mean, notice I'm talking about climate change, not global warming. When we first started talking about this, we talked about global warming because of this general increase in the average temperature of the globe. But we know that climate change is so much more than that. And I'll show you in a minute. We also know that it's not always getting warmer year after year. But if you look back to 2001, we talk about things as if they are either consistent or inconsistent with climate change. So 100 physical processes are consistent with the well-known mechanisms with system responses. Poleward migrations consistent with process level understanding. The example I gave you before with the mountainside plants moving down would have been considered inconsistent with climate change. So think about that for a minute. Is that example where the plants respond to both temperature and water really inconsistent with climate change, or is it just inconsistent with this generalization that we make about what, on average, we expect to see out in nature? And I would argue that it's the latter. It's entirely consistent with our understanding of the way the world works. It's entirely consistent with our understanding of how climate change drives weather, that drives the plants. It just doesn't happen to fit that generalization, yet that's the way we talk about it. So for the rest of the talk, what I want to kind of get back to is, are generalizations good enough? Are these kind of sound bites where we talk about plant species shifting upwards in elevation, or range boundaries of plants and animals moving towards the poles, are those generalizations actually a good framework to talk about climate change? And even more importantly, are they useful? I mean, are we past the point where talking about this in sound bites really doesn't do us any good more? We really have to roll up our sleeves, understand the details in order to prepare for climate change. And you can guess where we're going to come down on this. So as an example, this is a recent paper that's looking at the edge of a species distribution. So typically species will have one edge at the cold edge of the distribution where they'll stop, and if they go any closer to the poles, they can't because it's too cold. And at the southern edge, they can't go any closer to the equator because it's too warm. And so again, the generalized expectation under climate change is that you should expect to see a poleward range shift, whereas things get too hot at the equatorial end, the animals die off and they start expanding northward. So what this paper did is called a meta-analysis. They looked at where those range edges were and where they moved relative to no movement at all, 0. And anything that's a positive value means that it's moving towards the poles. Those are the central tendencies, and those little whiskers tell you the variability around that. And on average, what you see is, on average, it holds with a general trend. We start seeing these generalized movements towards the poles. But is all this stuff down here signal, or is it noise? I mean, is everything down here inconsistent with our understanding of climate change, or is it consistent with our understanding of the mechanism, but not with the generalization? So how do we become more sophisticated in our understanding of how global change will affect things that we care about? And so this is what my lab does. We do so not only for scientific interest, but a lot of what we do is focused on climate adaptation. There's been a recent shift to consider not only mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing the drivers of climate change, but also to recognize that it's going to continue to change. Even if we magically shut off all greenhouse gas emissions right now, there's still enough inertia in the system that it's going to continue to warm. Sea levels are going to continue to rise. We're going to continue to have melting of the polar ice caps. And on top of that, we're not seeing any signs of the U.S. Most of the U.S. showing any signs of slowing down anytime soon. Which means that not only do we have to work in the front of reducing the root cause, but we also have to prepare for these impacts. And that's what climate adaptation is. But a lot of it plays out at a very local level. So we work with the city of Boston on climate preparedness for the city of Boston with Cambridge. They can't work with these large generalizations. They can't work with an IPCC prediction that describes processes across the whole globe. They have to understand, how's Boston special? How's Boston different from Cambridge? How is this likely to play out at a very local level? Because climate change is not uniform in space or time. The other thing is that when we're confronting climate change, You often hear climate change is the military considers it a threat multiplier. So the Department of Defense, the Pentagon considers climate change, along with terrorism, one of the top 2 threats to U.S. military preparedness. And it's because it's a threat multiplier. It makes everything else that much worse. It's not creating something new, it's making something that much worse. What that means is even if we can't reduce something like warmer waters or increase flood levels, we can reduce the other things that it interacts with. And again, I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And then the third thing is, as a biologist, we know that there's a lot of differential vulnerability among species out there. So some species are doing really well under climate change, some are doing really poorly. How can we take that knowledge and do something useful with it? How can we inform someone who wants to do aquaculture or a farmer to say, well, if you switch from this species to this species, probably you're going to be a lot safer than if you kind of stick with what you've been doing for the past 30 years. So the first thing to kind of get to, though, is the difference between climate and weather. And again, this ends up causing a lot of confusion. Where climate is defined as this long-term, usually a 30-plus year trend in weather conditions, so that if you look at this graph of annual temperatures over time, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, but the long-term trend is what we're looking at with climate. This is the source of a lot of this discussions we have. So if next year is colder than it is this year, is that evidence that climate change is not happening? No. If next year is warmer than this year, is that evidence that climate change is happening? Also no. You have to look at the trends over time. You have to look at the repeated changes relative to the mean over time. So even though we have this variability from year to year, it's that long-term trend that we're talking about. So climate's a 30-year trend in weather. Climate is still a very useful term. It's why we started talking about this in the scientific community without thinking of what that means for communication to the non-scientific community. If we look at an average difference of 6 degrees, which is about the same in magnitude as what we might see by 2100 in the opposite direction, that's the difference between now and the last ice age. So that's the total heat on the surface of the globe. Is about 6 degrees different now than the last ice age. So think about the magnitude of the difference between now and the last ice age, and then go in the opposite direction. That's what we're talking about by 2100. But that's really hard to capture if we think in terms of our daily lives, in terms of weather. So even if I took today and then stacked 6 degrees on top of it, it really wouldn't seem like a big deal. Maybe it would seem like a really big deal if it was 101 instead of 95. But really, when we're talking about climate, we're talking about the total heat of the globe, and it's defined by those weather patterns. So a really good way to think about this is, it's climate trains the weather, but it's weather that really throws the punches. Or if anybody here, I'm a huge Red Sox fan. If you are hopefully the Astros, even though it's John Farrell that has trained the Red Sox, gotten them to having 2 years in a row where they won the division, you're not scared of John Farrell when you're a pitcher. You're scared of Mookie Betts. That's the weather. That's what's going to drive the home runs. Another way to think about this, a friend of mine describes climate is the number of sweaters and T-shirts you have in your closet. Weather is every day whether you choose to put on a sweater or a T-shirt. And so, if we're getting more and more T-shirts, it doesn't mean that every day is going to be warm, but that's the overall trend. This distinction really makes a huge difference functionally. So if you remember back to 2013, turns out that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of other large bodies of water on Earth. The changes we've seen have been tremendous. So 2012, not 2013. In 2012, the water temperatures of the Gulf of Maine were up to 3 degrees C warmer than what is normal. You could see that early on in the record. This is a temperature trace with blue is what we call the climatology. That's the average of what we normally see. The gray is 2012. And you can see even early in the spring, it was getting a lot warmer early on until later in the summer, it peaked to 3 degrees warmer. This had huge impacts on local fisheries. The way it works in this part of the world is that the U.S. lobster fishery kicks in before the Canadian fishery does, and it's timed so that the market does not get glutted with lobsters from the Americans before the Canadians can get their pots in the water. What happened in 2012 is that lobster fishers are pulling in lobsters hand over fist so fast, the market got glutted, and even before the Canadians could get their pots in the water, lobster tails were already cheap, and it caused this huge economic ripple that spans international borders. We're still seeing a lot of lobsters, not just due to temperature, but also because we don't have cod eating them. Unfortunately, we're already starting to see shell disease impacting them as well. So lobsters are doing better under slightly warmer temperatures, except that now we're also seeing an increase in the incidence of disease as well. So, but this is weather. I mean, this is a warm summer. This is part of climate change. It's being driven by climate change, but the impact was felt because that summer was warmer. And so it's weather that really is throwing the punch. So what my lab keeps coming back to, we do is called ecological forecasting. Is, how can we use our scientific understanding of nature to prepare society for what we're already seeing and for what we know we're going to see in the future. And the way we think about forecasting is kind of a form of triage. I was doing an interview with a reporter a couple of years ago and explaining that what we try to do is we go on the ground and we identify hot spots where there are likely to be trouble. We identify places that will be likely be good in the future, and we identify those that are on the edge. He said, well, that really sounds like if you're a first responder and you're going to a train wreck. If anyone's been in that community, you know that there are toe tags. You go and you identify those victims, that if there is, frankly, there's nothing you can do to save them, you're not going to prioritize your energy and your time and your resources on that person at the expense of saving everyone else. Likewise, if there's someone that's doing just fine, that's sitting there, just get them some water and set them aside, you can prioritize them lower as well. It's the ones that, if you act quickly, you can save. Those that are right on the edge, that you prioritize your resources and your time, and that's effectively what we try to do with this form of triage. So just as one example of this, is what we call marine spatial planning. Resources are always limited, as is political willpower, political power. Say, and I always have the caveat, don't take the stars too literally. You see, that's my house, and this is So say that we want to create a marine protected area, someplace where we don't allow fishing. We're going to allow the population to bounce back, to recover, which will then have what we call spillover effects to seed the surrounding populations. We've only got enough money or political willpower to do that in one place. Where are we going to put it? The worst thing we could do is if we put it at a site where it may be doing okay now, but we're pretty sure 20 years down the line, it's gone. Then we've thrown good money after bad. We've just blown away all of our political willpower. So we want to find a place that's going to be not only healthy now, but as healthy as it can be, maybe with intervention in the future. Likewise, if there's some place that there's nothing you can do, it's really not worth emphasizing your efforts. And this is a controversial statement, I'll admit. I mean, right now, where we're seeing this is in coral reefs. There are coral reefs that, frankly, there's nothing we're going to be able to do to save them. And that is awful to tell a local resident that really, there's nothing we're going to be able to do to save your reef. But that's the fact of life. The ones that are interesting to me then are those that are right on the edge, that with even minimal intervention, we can prevent that combination of stressors from tipping them over the edge. So we may give low priority to the site where animals are going to die no matter what we do. We're going to protect the site that is healthiest. But these, for example, even if we can't change water temperature, we may be able to reduce fishing pressure. We know that once populations get low, they have a really hard time bouncing back. We may have a little bit of funding for an anti-pollution campaign. So here's where you're getting a lot of bang for your buck by triaging where these sites are, by understanding how all these non-climatic factors interact with things like ocean acidification and increased temperature. One great example of this is often used is there's an oyster fishery on the west coast that was finding that the larvae of its oysters were just dying all the time. What they found out is that the water from the intake line was pulling it from a place that had very low pH. As carbon dioxide gets absorbed in the seawater, it lowers the pH of the water, so it's just turning it acid. It was killing the larvae of those oysters. They couldn't move the hatchery, but the solution was, well, they monitored it, and because it's changing over time, because we see these fluctuations, they shut off the water supply and had an emergency water supply that they could use while the pH was low. So they understood when the trouble spot, when the trouble was likely to rise, they could then mitigate against it. Now the hatchery is going strong because of that intervention. So this is what we do. We take Large-scale weather were funded by NASA and NOAA and NSF. We take weather data, we take satellite data, we downscale it to the level of organisms we care about in coastal regimes, and then we kind of scale back up to societal impacts. So we do these kind of what-if scenarios to say, well, where do we expect the problem sites to be? Where do we expect the healthy sites to be? What are the main drivers of that? How do we do anything about it? So in the kind of remaining time I have here, I want to tell you why this is difficult, why we can't just kind of run out there and do it really quickly. And it's three things. I mean, the first is that, as I mentioned before, climate change is global, but it plays out very locally from place to place. Organisms have very, very different ways of experiencing their worlds, and then species have different physiological tolerances to those changes. So the first thing, again, is to look at what we really mean by climate change. So this is a map that shows the temperature anomaly over time, where red is an anomaly of 6.6 degrees C over normal, and blue is -6. What you can see is it varies a lot over the surface of the globe. The poles are getting particularly hit because as we melt the ice caps, there's less light that's being reflected back into space, so you get a feedback loop so that the poles are really warming. There are places that have warmed by 9 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 50 years alone in the poles. We're expecting by 2030 to have ice-free Arctic during a large portions of the year. But also notice that there are sites that are getting colder. I mean, this site in the North Atlantic is substantially colder than it normally is. And it's because heat is being moved around the surface of the globe. So we may talk about this as a 1 degree increase in average surface temperature, but that encompasses a lot of variability. Why we're worried about this is the vast majority of places are getting warmer. Not that every site on the globe is. There's this awful book by Michael Crichton a couple years ago that I spent a year writing op-eds fighting, where State of Fear, where his central thesis is that if climate change is real, every spot in the globe should be getting warmer. That's like saying if you go to Vancouver, British Columbia, and it is warmer than Asheville, North Carolina, therefore Canada is warmer than the United States. No, you have to look at all the different points, you have to look at the trends, you have to look at what's causing that. And I was living in South Carolina at the time, and it happened that a couple sites in South Carolina were staying the same or getting a little colder. But that's the type of kind of misinformation we have to combat. No, we know that heat's being moved around. We know that not every site in the globe is getting warmer. It's that the vast majority of them are, and that there's variability. But if you're a little tree frog sitting in a tree or a barnacle on the shore, you could care less what the 30-year running average of average global surface temperature is. I mean, all you care about is whether your little corner of the world is too hot or too wet or too dry for you to survive. And I would argue, as humans, it's pretty much what we care about in our kind of selfish view of the world too. We care what's happening in a very local environment. So getting down to that hyperlocal level is what we spend a lot of time doing. And it ends up being a lot more complex than you think, because we have this very biased way of viewing the world. So as one example, I mean, we're all sitting here breathing. We're forcing ventilation. We're forcing air over the surface of our lungs that goes into alveoli that causes oxygen exchange. Most animals out there, if I look at something like a sea anemone or a coral, they don't have that ability. They don't have the ability to ventilate. It's as if you took your lungs, you reached in, grabbed your lungs, pulled them out, and held them over the surface of your head, and you wait for the wind to blow. And if the wind doesn't blow, you're not going to breathe. I mean, the only way you're getting oxygen exchange is when the air is moving over the surface of your lungs, caused by ambient flow. Same thing happens with these guys, so that if water is very still, they have a really hard time exchanging things like nutrients, like gases, like waste with the surrounding environment. And it also means that the shape of the coral, the sea anemone, makes a really big difference. So if you're streamlined, even if the water is moving at a pretty good clip, you're going to have a really hard time getting stuff from the outside world or delivering it to it. Versus if you have a shape that induces a lot of turbulence, you'll do a lot better. Now, this guy's going to do a lot better in a storm than this one is, but that's the way they perceive the world, and the only control they have. They can't do like we do and control ventilation by breathing faster or slower. It's all due to their shape. Another example that you've probably seen before, that of flowers. So this is the way we see it in the visible spectrum. This is the way that an insect that can see in the ultraviolet can see it. So this is a false color image of what a bee sees the flower like. And once you're able to perceive those wavelengths, things like these runways appear and these bullseyes and all these things that are completely invisible to us, but the bees, the other insects are able to see it because they're equipped to. So same information, just a different way of looking at it. And we can parse this. We can look at the range of wavelengths that the human eye can see. We can look at the range of wavelengths that a hummingbird or a bee can see. And we can understand why that information is coming in there. It's just at a range of wavelengths that we're not capable of detecting. The same thing happens, or a very similar thing happens, when we think about temperature and heat. If anybody's ever had a pet lizard or pet snake or anything like that, you get it a hot rock or you get it a lamp, or have you ever seen a lizard standing on a rock on a cold morning? 99% of organisms on Earth don't make their own metabolic heat. So mammals and birds do. We're able to metabolically make up the difference. If we get too cold, we can kick up our metabolism. If we get too warm, we can lose heat through sweating. Most animals out there, in all plants, or almost all plants, are gaining heat with their environment through these passive means. So a lot of it is through shortwave radiation from the sun. They're losing heat through convection. They are losing heat through conduction, where you have direct contact with the surface, and if your body is warmer than the surface, you'll shed heat, and if it's colder, you'll bring in heat. Some of these things are familiar to us. I mean, we know if we go out and we stand out in the sun, we feel a lot warmer, but some of them really aren't. And infrared is one of those where it's not familiar to us. But just as the shape of that sea anemone affected how much gas it was getting, how much oxygen it was getting, the shape of something like a sea star or mussel, the color, how much wetness it has, drives how much heat it's taking up from its environment. So this is a sea star on the west coast of North America called Pisaster. They like to eat mussels, so this is one sitting in the mussel bed. And this is an infrared image, just like that UV image. It's turned it into something we can see. This animal is sitting there at 12 degrees C. It's feeding on a mussel that is at 21 degrees C. Air temperature may be somewhere around 16 degrees C. They're not making any heat. They're under exactly identical environments out there, but they're receiving heat in very different ways. So it means that when we talk about air temperature, it's really only half of the story. And it's hard to think about that. So I think this is the next. All right. So we can use simple physics to keep track of this. We can construct heat budgets that keep track of heat exchange between animals and the surrounding environments. And if I can get this to work. Sorry, my prop turned itself off. Oh. There we go. That's right. Shoot, I apologize. This is not working. Afterwards, if anyone wants to come up, you can see yourselves in infrared. Man. So infrared is, we spent a lot of time thinking about this. If anybody is an astronomer, an amateur astronomer, or has had a class, you remember that the color of a star tells you about its temperature, right? So if we look at a blue star, a yellow star, a red star, it tells us about what the temperature of the surface is, because the wavelength of light that's being emitted is related to the temperature of the planet. So we know the relationship between temperature and color. Turns out everything in the universe above absolute zero is emitting light. So we're sitting here emitting light to one another. All the objects around us are. But at our temperatures, it's emitting it in a very long wavelength in these infrared. And so all that is really a camera that detects this very long wave emissions, but they're transmitting heat. I mean, one of the cool things we do with kids in a classroom, if I stand here long enough without touching the wall, eventually you'll start seeing a heat ghost. Or if I, one of the things I'll have them do is walk barefoot across the floor, and you can see the ghost of their footprints walking across the floor, because heat has been shed, and it's emitting light in the infrared spectrum. that's part of the heat budget we keep track of. It also helps us to kind of visualize those differences. So this is an infrared picture of a koala in the Sydney Zoo. These are limpets and snails in Botany Bay, Australia, where this is a piece of rock about this big. It's curved about like that. These guys are facing the sun a little bit more, and they have a darker color than these, but while these guys are sitting there at 40 degrees C, these are comfortably sitting there at 30 degrees C, just because of slight differences in shading. So what that means is it's really difficult to say, well, if air temperature is this is what the animal temperature is. So what we do is we essentially make weather forecasts using this approach. We can take very large scale data sets, downscale them to the level of organisms, use computer models to keep track of what they are in the field, and then we literally make maps around the world. We use the Intertidal Zone because it's one of the most physically harsh environments on the planet. Animals are exposed to air every day at low tide, so these are marine organisms that have to contend with being exposed to solar radiation for 8 hours a day in some cases. So it's thought to be an early warning system for the impacts of climate change. So we build these biophysical models, we test them in the field. The other thing we do, and this is what Samantha was saying that the New York Times jumped on, is we build these things that Discover magazines called robomuscles. Turns out that just like the color and the shape and the materials of an animal drive how much heat is exchanging, the same thing happens with a sensor. So this is a commercial sensor that's made by a company called Onset down in the Cape. If you put this thing out in a mussel bed, the average difference between this and what the animals are experiencing is 14 degrees C. So that's your average air is 14 degrees, which is enormous. If, however, you encase this in a shell that has the same thermal properties, so the same mass, specific heat, the same shape, now we can get to within 2 degrees. Why that's important then is we put these things around the world. We have them at 71 sites worldwide, recording essentially continuously. We've had them in some sites recording every 10 minutes since 1998. And we just released that data set. That's why New York Times picked up on it. You get fundamentally different predictions about where climate change is impacting coastal ecosystems than if you look at the human viewpoint based on air. So this is just a graph showing the extreme temperatures and kind of the average extremes from Santa Barbara, California, up to British Columbia, Vancouver. And rather than things getting kind of cooler as you move towards the poles and warm as you get towards Southern California, we see what we're calling a mosaic. It's getting hotter, it's getting colder, it's getting hotter and colder. So that there are places in central Oregon, largely because low tide's happening in summer in the middle of the day, that are getting as hot or hotter than Southern California. From the human perspective, there's no way you believe that, right? I mean, if you go up to Oregon, it's going to feel really good compared to what Santa Barbara and Los Angeles have experienced. But because of the way they're interacting with their local world, you see these mosaics, and this has been tested in a number of different ways. You can test their physiology, you can test their growth rates, and it all holds up. Why that matters is it means that things aren't necessarily going to be worse down here at the southern edge, but we're probably going to start seeing holes punched in the distribution of these species. And since we came out with this paper in 2002, it's now been shown around the world, not only in coastal systems, but in tree line systems and in other places. I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to try to, how much, like 5 more minutes? Or are we running out?
We have like 10 minutes.
Okay, all right. So that's how organisms see their world, how they experience it. The other piece is, well, okay, once we know what their temperatures are, what do we do with that? So we've known that animals and plants have different responses to things like temperature for a long time, right? Anybody that's ever planted a garden knows that you plant species X in March and species Y in April. And so you can look at optimal temperature for vegetation, for reproduction, for crop yield, for all these different crops. This is a report from the USDA that looks at impacts of climate change on these species. So warmer and wetter is good for some species and it's bad for other ones. So that if you are a farmer and you have some flexibility in what you plant, you want to change that depending on what the conditions are that year. Same thing occurs for every other organism on Earth. So this is 3 species of a fish called hake and how they've moved. So the silver hake, this is where they were found in the 1960s. The red is the high density. What you can see is that generally they have moved to the north. Red hake have moved to the north and a little to the east. but spotted hake really haven't done a whole lot. They really haven't moved because their physiologies are different. They all have very different sensitivities to temperature. Now, it turns out that species that do well under changed temperature tend to be things we don't like. They tend to be pests. They tend to be pests because they do well under a bunch of different conditions. So mosquitoes love climate change. They can do well under a bunch of different scenarios. If you've heard of lionfish, lionfish are an invasive species that are moving up the east coast of the U.S. I think they made it up to Cape Hatteras. They're really pretty, but they eat the babies of all the other fish. And so they're having this huge impact. There's this, just an aside, there's this awesome program by a bunch of chefs called Eat More Lionfish. They're coming out with lionfish recipes to try to eradicate these fish. Conversely, the ones that do the worst are those that are already in danger, that have very, very narrow limits that they can tolerate. So they're what we call endemic species, where there's only one part of the world that they can tolerate it. So any changes means that they're just not going to be able to survive that. But it means, realistically, there are winners and losers under climate change. And we look at body temperature because it drives just about every physiological process. Again, the only time we really think about that is if we get hypothermia or if we get a prolonged fever. But these are animals that are having temperatures that are changing by 20 degrees C or more over a course of a couple of hours. But just like if anybody's had ceviche, you put fish in lime juice, it's denaturing the proteins. It's making the proteins fly apart. Same thing happens when you cook them. Same thing happens when an animal gets too hot in the field. They're very slowly cooking. One of my favorite biological terms is called a molecular chaperone. That when proteins start flying apart, they have sticky ends, and they have what we call inappropriate interactions. So heat shock proteins are chaperones that prevent inappropriate interactions. They keep the sticky ends of the proteins from glomming onto each other and then return them safely to how they're supposed to be. I've got 2 young daughters, so I really do. So we're literally seeing animals cooking slowly in the field. And we measure this by what's called a thermal performance curve. And again, for every organism on Earth, you can have something like this, where there's this optimal temperature. If you increase it a little bit, they may survive, but they won't do well. If you increase it too much, they die. Likewise, if you get a little bit too cold, you can survive, but there's a limit to which you can't tolerate it. In some animals, the difference between optimal and death is 20 degrees, and others, like corals, maybe a degree or 2. So that really helps us define how close to the limits these animals are in the field. So putting these two things together means that these impacts are probably happening places that we're not looking, because we tend to look at range edges, because we tend to talk about just these generalizations. But if we understand these kind of winners and losers, we have a better way of looking at the world through a much more sophisticated lens. So this leads to where we're heading with this, and it's this idea of early warning systems. It's kind of like a hurricane forecast, that the longer you look, the harder it is to make an exact prediction. If we make a hurricane prediction 2 weeks from now, we really don't know where it's going to end up. We have a cone that we're confident in. Likewise, we don't know what the weather is going to be like on July 23rd, 2048. We know that on average, the climate is going to be training the weather. We're going to have on average more extreme events. But as a society, if we want to respond to that, it's on a very local, short time scale limit. And where this becomes interesting to me in the position that I'm in is that for a lot of this, it's not the science that's limiting us. We know full well how lobsters respond to temperature. We know with increasing temperatures what's that's likely to do to their growth rates. The problem is, what do you do about it? So, early on in 2012, we could tell that temperatures are getting warmer. We could have predicted pretty easily that lobsters would grow more that season. They would grow to harvestable molt. But what are you going to do about that? I mean, lobster fishers aren't suddenly able to convert their pots into fishing for scallops or fishing for something else that's doing better. They don't have the gear for it. So a lot of this discussion is coming back to, how do we recognize that there's uncertainty in this? We know that there's variability out there. We know that there are limits to our predictions. But how do we build flexibility into policies to help people like fishers, like farmers, be flexible enough that they can adapt to these kind of rapid changes? And this is the kind of early warning systems. So this is one example. I work with a group in University of Palermo in Italy. We've used these models to look at where aquaculture sites around the Mediterranean are likely to be impacted the most and the least. So we can provide some guidance about where prioritization should be and where they want to grow their mussels. And we're trying to do similar things around here as well. So just in the last 2 minutes, I don't have time. I just want to finish with, what does this mean for communication? What does this mean for somebody like you that is talking about climate change? Where the last thing I want to do is end up trying to say that, well, climate change isn't happening, or that it's so complex we can't do anything about it. Because we really do understand a lot about this. We really understand the mechanisms really well. It's just that nature and life is really messy, and that's the reality of it. But somehow, as we as a society get more and more polarized, we're backed into our corners where we'll say one mantra and another mantra, and we'll just shout back and forth to one another, where no one will hear anything what you're saying. So, if you read this, my words came out fine, they were just processed incorrectly by your brain. How do we move to this point where we're able to communicate at scales that are relevant and try to skirt around some of these tropes that we find ourselves falling into? And again, I think stepping away from just talking about generalizations, just talking about, no, this is exactly what climate change is going to do, and pretending that we know exactly what's going to happen, is going to have to make room for, all right, there's a lot we don't know, but there's a lot we do know. Let's figure out how to build policies around that are flexible enough to deal with the uncertainty of what we do. So, I won't have time to talk about this today, but we work with psychologists on campus, we work with communications people, and we look at this idea that sound bites may actually have hampered our ability to communicate climate change. We look at how weather events like the recent hurricanes affect people's perceptions of nature. And look at this idea that if we just kind of stick to our guns and just, even when we get a result that makes total sense biologically, like that example with the plants, we don't stick to our guns and just say, no, this is the way the world works. We really delve into those details to explain that we really do understand climate change, and so we can do something about it. So I didn't get a chance to show you this to you. We have a cool website. We also do a lot of virtual reality tours. You can look on the website where, as Samantha mentioned, I work in the Middle East. I work in Israel, in Iraq. I do a lot of work in China. And a lot of what we're doing right now is getting high school kids in many of those places to talk to one another. We have a program right now where you have kids in Israel communicating with kids in Boston and in Paris, all kind of comparing the local environments using some of the tools we've talked about. If you have time, it's all on our website. So I know I'm running late, so I'll stop and see if I can take some questions. Thanks.
I think that's how we can bring peace to the world.